All right, away we go. So today, my special guest is Brian Godawa, and Brian is a professional writer and filmmaker, and he brings amazing stories to life on the printed page and on the big screen. Brian has a brand new fiction series called Chronicles of the Watchers, and book one, which is titled The Dragon King, just released this past February. So, Brian, thanks for joining us on today's show.
Thanks for having me, Shaun. Great to be here.
Well, first off, let's give listeners a chance to get to know you a bit better. You know, if I was out in LA, and actually I'm coming to LA in April, so maybe I'll bump into you in a coffee shop. But if I said, "Hey, Brian, who are you? What are you about? What do you do?" How might you respond to that question?
Well, basically, I'm a Hollywood screenwriter, and but now I'm a novel author, and I've been that way for like the last 5 years or so, writing novels. But my background comes from screenwriting. My break-in movie was about 12 years ago called To End All Wars, and it stars Kiefer Sutherland. And that's the movie. It's so funny. That's the movie I'm most proud of. And after all these years, I made a few movies after that, but really nothing got as good as that first one. And that's not uncommon, actually. So I've been writing screenplays for all these years. And about now it's about 6 years ago or so, I I came up with a screenplay that I thought, man, this would be really unique, because I started doing some research on the story of Noah, and I thought, wow, do a screenplay on the movie of Noah. No one's ever come up with this stuff, because there's some wild stuff going on there, right? And of course, I eventually found out. Well, I wrote the script and everything, and I eventually found out that Darren Aronofsky was making his movie on Noah, and I realized, well, you know what? Okay, so he beat me to the punch. I thought, man, the stuff that I researched about the days of Noah was so fascinating. I had never really learned it before. I'd known about stuff that was there, but it was weird stuff that I just avoided because, sometimes that weird stuff in the Bible, you're afraid to tackle it, for fear of what you might discover, And so but as I did the research on it, the Nephilim, the Watchers, the giants, that kind of stuff, I soon discovered that was such a fascinating storyline, and I wanted to get that out. Anyway, and I thought, oh, wow, if Aronofsky found this stuff, then he's going to beat me to the punch. So I realized, well, I could write a novel, because then at least the novel would get out before the movie, and I could at least be satisfied in myself knowing that as an author, I'm saying that authors have that sort of desire to be the first one out with the idea. But anyway, so it turned out that, he really didn't have almost anything that I had found researched, because he went down a different direction, and entirely with Noah, the movie Noah. So that was good, but what it did was it launched me on my novel career, because that was my first book that I wrote, and it became quite popular, and a self-published novel, by the way, too. And went up in Amazon and all the rankings, was in the top 10. It's still in the top 10 of biblical fiction on Amazon. And I realized, wow, there's more to this storyline. It's not just a weird anomaly. Giants in the Bible during the days of Noah, the sons of God mate with the daughters of men, and they bore them giants or Nephilim. And it's not just like one weird thing, but it actually is a storyline. And that was the storyline that I decided to write, called Chronicles of the Nephilim, which is now 8 novels. And it starts with Noah Primeval. That's the first novel. The second novel is Enoch Primordial, which is kind of like a prequel. And I jump back into the days of Enoch, when the Watchers originally fell from heaven. And then I move forward through the Bible. I jump periods, Abraham, David, and then ultimately Jesus. And it deals with this whole concept of what I call the War of the Seed, which is based in the Genesis 3:15, the first messianic prophecy in the Bible, that says, when God's cursing the serpent, and he says, your seed will war or be at enmity with the seed of the woman, and it says, you shall bite his heel, he shall crush your head. And that singular seed is, of course, referring to Christ, and the Messiah ultimately crushes the head of the serpent, right? So, wow, there's this whole storyline, that enmity throughout all history. And that was sort of the story that I ended up telling. So my goal in the Chronicles of the Nephilim was, to wrap it up quick, is to to tell all this, retell the stories in the Bible where giants or watchers appear. These watchers are the sons of God, the heavenly divine beings. To retell these stories, being true to the Bible as possible, but of course filling in with a lot of imagination, because of course the Bible will mention giants, but it doesn't tell us a lot of details about them. So I tried to fill in those details based on historical and mythological research as well, what the ancient cultures and the pagans believed at the time, and try to mesh, not mesh them together, but try to make sense of how it all works together within a Christian worldview paradigm. And so it's come out as Chronicles of the Nephilim. And as of this day, every one of the 8 novels are in the top 10 or top 20 of biblical fiction still. So they've been selling really well, and that inspired me to write the next series, which is called Chronicles of the Watchers. And that's the book that was just released. The first book is called The Dragon King. And I can tell you the story about that if you want. But basically what the basic storyline is, it's the story of the first emperor of China. And we tell it, I have a co-author whose name is Charlie Wen. And to sort of just give you the brief log line, and we can go from there, it's 220 BC, 220 BC. The ancient Western Empire is crumbling. In a desperate bid to save his throne, the Greek king over Babylon sends his son Antiochus, a dishonored warrior, into the mysterious land of the far east to capture a mythical creature that will give him absolute power, a dragon. And that's the sort of log line of the story, but it opens up to a lot more of other fascinating material as well.
Man, you covered a lot of ground with just one question. That was impressive. I want to take a step back from the books for a second. I'm curious for you, when did you develop an interest or love of storytelling, and which came first, the screenplays or the books? Like what's your timeline of getting an interest? And just curious.
Yeah, it's one of those typical stories. I don't have a formal education in storytelling or in screenwriting. But it's one of those classic cliche scenarios where, as a kid, I loved movies. I watched tons of movies and stuff. And I became a Christian right before I got into college. And, around that time, I started realizing how powerful movies were, how they affected us. And as a Christian, I studied Francis Schaeffer, and I began to see and understand how art communicates worldview. And I began to see how all these movies I was watching were communicating worldview to me without my even realizing it. And much of it, of course, is not good because it's either a secular worldview or a non-Christian worldview. And I realized that in some ways, I could easily be manipulated because I didn't know what was going on. So I was letting myself be carried away by the story, and therefore the power of story can change your ethics and your view without even knowing it. And it impacted me so much that I realized, I want to make movies for God then, I want to tell stories that would honor God and that would bring that worldview. Unfortunately, I didn't have the formal education because I was being trained as a graphic artist. So I studied it on the side. I did it as a hobby, as a love. And for many years, I studied storytelling, screenwriting, read all the books, went to seminars, that kind of stuff. So I'm self-taught. And like a year after I got married, was when I really started to devote myself to that on the side. And so it took a few years before things started coming together. I wrote a few scripts, won some contests, and my first movie was made years later, which was To End All Wars, And so in the process of that journey, I developed my own aesthetic or my own sort of theory of beauty, which included understanding how storytelling works and the nature of storytelling. And how to work within a Christian worldview in that sense. And so what I did was, after a few years, I developed this aesthetic. I wanted to share that with other Christians, and that became the book, my first book, which was Hollywood Worldviews. And the subtitle is Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment, because I know that there's in the Christian world, there's a lot of media watchdogs that point out everything that's wrong, and there is much that is wrong with the media. But as a person in the media, I felt like there's a lot that Christians miss and a lot they don't understand. So they throw the baby out with the bathwater. If movies have swearing in it, don't watch any of them, that kind of stuff. But there's also the extreme where, like in California, Christians tend to be the opposite. Because their freedom in Christ, they feel they can watch anything, or Christians just think it's just entertainment. Come on, don't make such a big deal out of it. I have a lot of friends who are like that. Brian, it's just entertainment. And I understood, no, it isn't. It's more than that. But there's a lot of good mixed in with the bad. And so I wanted to help Christians to understand how to discern that difference and draw from the good and reject the bad, And so that was the beginning. That book actually became a pretty good seller. It's still used in universities across the land, Christian universities usually, film school and stuff, because it really opens people's eyes to that. So my approach to storytelling is a full-orbed, a full integrated understanding. I want to tell entertaining stories. It's a top priority for me. It's got to be well crafted. None of this bad Christian movie, bad Christian novel garbage. I want entertainment. However, I also understand how a worldview is woven within the art, woven into the art, so that you get a package, a package of beauty, a package of entertainment, along with, meaning, purpose, or what have you.
Well, one of the things that really has impressed me about your writing is, for anybody who's read a bit, with ancient Near Eastern cultures and that sort of thing, you're very well researched, which kind of surprised me a bit as far as getting into a novel and a fiction story. Just the amount of detail. You can tell that you spent a lot of time preparing and learning along the way. For you, what does your research look like? How many hours do you put into prepping? And
hundreds. I've always had a love for philosophy and theology. And so I kind of say that I write theological novels because I've come to realize that theology is again part of worldview, how you interpret the world and how you live it. But most people, or let's put it this way, many people are not as interested in the abstract art or sciences of theology and philosophy, right? And I understand that and I accept that. A lot of it's very hard to understand, hard to follow. So I want to bring that theology to the people, so to speak. And so I incarnate it within my storytelling. And so my novels become a way that I can basically share the research of all the stuff that I'm interested in looking into, but I know a lot of people aren't. And I put it into stories that fascinate people, and that's how they get the theology, so to speak, right? So that's one way of seeing it, or one way of doing it. But I do hundreds of hours of research during, before, and after I write a novel. And what I've done is, because my Chronicles of the Nephilim were sort of controversial, I know, I am actually a Reformed evangelical Christian. So I'm a pretty standard Christian in many ways. But I realize that some people, this ancient Near Eastern background to the Bible really frightens them. And I think that there's a new awareness of approaching the Bible through its own original context, through the eyes of an ancient Hebrew, not the eyes of a modern Westerner. And I think that it's scaring a lot of evangelicals, and because it's showing us that a lot of things we thought the Bible was saying is not. And that's not unorthodox or liberal. It's actually biblical, and it's the evangelical world that has to correct itself. And I'm not afraid to face those facts, and I have. And so I share that stuff through the stories. And I think that because of that is why I started to put an appendix at the back of each of my novels, where I give an explanation, and I share the research, the biblical, the historical, and the mythological research that I use to craft the stories. And I was inspired by Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton used to do that. And with his novels, he would have an appendix where he talks about the real science that the fiction was based on. Well, I'm doing the same thing, only with, biblical and historical research, right? And it's turned out that Christians have really been loving that. Many of them have said, I love it as much as the novel. I think that's because they're hungry to know, where does this stuff come from? Is he making this stuff up? And they're like, no, it's really coming from real research, right? And excuse me. And so there's been a really positive response to it. And so I intend to try to do that as much as possible. I didn't do that with this latest novel, The Dragon King. I wanted to make it more fast moving. And I don't know, I just felt like this was a series that I wouldn't do that on. But the next series, I'm going back to that. I'm going to be footnoting, giving all the research so that people can really, follow. But yeah, that's kind of the heart of it.
Well, and yeah, I will say, if you encounter any of Brian's books in the Chronicles of the Nephilim, really, it's worth your time to read the appendix in the books. You will learn a lot. He'll point you to other thoughts, resources that you're probably going to want to check out if you're really grooving on the story and enjoying them. So read the appendix. It's well worth your time. You had mentioned earlier that you have a co-author for the new series. Just curious how you got connected with Charlie, and why did you guys decide to collaborate on a project together?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this didn't start out as a Chronicles of the Watchers. Basically, Charlie Wen, who was the past creator of the visual department at Marvel Studios. I mean, this guy's like an amazing artist. He crafted the visual look and feel of a lot of movies your audience has probably seen, whether it's the Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor. He worked on all those movies to create the look and feel of the superheroes as well as the movie. And anyway, we go to church together. So we had been talking, hey, it'd be cool if we could do something together. He loved my Chronicles of the Nephilim. So we started to talking, and he said, Brian, he goes, I've always wanted to tell the story of the first emperor of China. And he told me the reason why is because there's sort of a spiritual, from a Christian worldview, there's some fascinating things that happened in that story. And he said, first of all, the first emperor was around 200 BC in China. And before that time, the dragon had been an emblem that some emperors might use, but it wasn't ubiquitous. But he was the one, after his time period, the dragon became a more ubiquitous symbol. And he said, and of course, it's fascinating because he is known, Qin Shi Huangdi is his name, and he is known for being a tyrant. Your listeners will probably be more familiar with him than they realize. He's the emperor who, before this time, for 1,000 years, China was broken up into feudal states that were constantly warring, and he brought peace. But he was a tyrant. He's the guy who finished building the Great Wall of China. He really did it. They started pieces before he was there, but he's the one who really said, okay, we're going to make this happen. And he's also the one who made those terracotta warriors that you've seen in documentaries where they've got thousands of these soldiers made out of terracotta and they're underground in China. That was for his tomb, right? So anyway, he said, at this time period, he brought in the dragon. And he said that from a Christian perspective, the dragon for us is really connected to Satan. And he goes, I'd love to see, explore that spiritual connection, right? And another element, and I said, well, Charlie, it's interesting because I actually read a little bit, and I told him I know about the Chinese language, and it turns out, I've done some research on that, where the ancient Chinese language, which goes back thousands of years, it shows a influence or a reflection of Genesis truths, meaning there are truths from the book of Genesis that are reflected in the Chinese language thousands of years before they had any contact with the Bible. They never had contact with the Bible, right? And Chinese Christians will tell you that that's because they believe they came from Babel and they spread out on the earth, and they brought with them some of those truths. And so, for instance, the word for boat or ship in China, because China, first of all, Chinese is a pictorial language, and even more so in the ancient version of it. But the word for ship is a little boat with 8 people in it. And that's, of course, there were 8 people who were saved in Noah's Ark, right? And there's lots of other connections. The word for tempter is like 2 trees in a garden with a snake. There's stuff like that that's just fascinating. And he said, wow, yeah, you already know that. And so we started realizing that there's this interesting connection that may go back to the Tower of Babel and all this. And as we developed the story together, we realized that, this is gonna fit within the Watcher paradigm that I developed in the Chronicles and the Nephilim. And the Watcher paradigm is the belief that in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that God separated the nations at Babel, and he placed the pagan nations under the authority of these fallen sons of God. In other words, he was saying, if you're going to keep worshiping false gods and build the Tower of Babel, then I'm going to reject you. I'm going to give you over to these false gods that you worship. And they have demonic reality to them, right? And I'm going to keep Israel, Jacob for myself, And so it's the notion that the geographical and physical nations actually have authorities over them. And we see this, spiritual authorities, right? We see this in the book of Daniel, where the prince of Persia fights with the prince of Greece. And these are spiritual princes, not physical princes. Because behind the earthly authorities are spiritual authorities. This is the biblical notion that Paul writes about when he says principalities and powers. He says, we fight not against flesh and blood, but these principalities and powers who are behind the earthly authorities. It's not just demons that are floating around, but there's actually, intelligent principalities and powers. And so this is the paradigm that we sort of worked into it. And we found while we were doing research and developing the story, we found some amazing connections that we didn't even anticipate. First, we were just going to sort of tell a story and hint at these connections. But then we found some more that were connected. And we wanted to tell a story that both East and West would enjoy. In other words, we thought of just telling the story in China, but then maybe it might be harder for the Westerners to appreciate. And Charlie said, well, I don't want to make a story where, the East are the bad guys, and the West are the good guys. And I said, well, I don't want to do the opposite. I don't want to make the West the bad guys and East the good guys. So we realized that there's 2 kingdoms that we wanted to tell a story to appeal to, the West and the East, because there's a higher kingdom above those that is, that is the true kingdom, right? And so we came up with a storyline of taking a hero that comes from the Greek kingdom that at the time in the West, the Greeks were, the King Antiochus the Great was the Greek Seleucid kingdom over Babylon and Mesopotamia. And so we figured out the storyline to bring one of those guys over into a journey into China and have this sort of East meets West, or as I like to say in my headline, East eats West, because of the dragon, right? So that's that's how it came about with Charlie. And we both bring to that, a love of both East and West. There's good and bad in all cultures, because there's a higher kingdom than all the other kingdoms that judges other kingdoms, right? And that's kind of our approach to it.
Well, and you've already kind of hinted a bit at some of the stakes that you're setting in the book, but from a time period perspective, what's the time frame that you're covering in this book? And then a few of the key places that you're going to take readers along the journey as far as cities or locations.
Yeah. The time period is 220 BC. So this will be right around, this will be a couple hundred years after Daniel. Daniel's in Babylon. And, he went on to teach the Magi. And the Magi were the ones who were looking for the Messiah, weren't they? Because when Jesus was born. See, so when Daniel came into Babylon and he affected the pagan priesthood of the Magi. So they're looking for this emperor from heaven, Messiah from heaven. So we actually brought them into our storyline as well. And that's where you can start to see that some of the connections. But so we start out in Mesopotamia around Babylon, go into China. And we basically, at that time period, it's hard to say some of these Chinese names of some of the cities, but they go on a journey into the interior all the way to the capital city at that time, which was Xianyang, I think it's called. So we see the capital. We journey to the Great Wall of China. We journey to the altar of heaven, where they have the border sacrifice. This is a whole other spiritual element that Charlie and I discovered was, and this is again what the Chinese Christians are telling the Chinese people. Chinese people say, "Oh, Christianity is just a Western religion, so it's not for us." And they say, "No, it's not." We go back to the Tower of Babel, and they point out the fact that before this first emperor, who brought a lot of good to the nation, he brought peace, he brought unity, he brought a single currency, and unity of language and all this. He also brought a lot of bad because before this time period, the ancient Chinese people would worship a single god without images. This is very unique and original. Why? Because in that time period before 200 BC, every other pagan nation on the earth worshipped multiple gods with images. Only Israel alone forbid the images used in worshiping God. So you see there's an interesting connection going on there that the Chinese had. And again, right around this time period, there was Taoism going on and Confucianism, but right around this time period is when the emperor sort of solidified the ancestor worship and the worship of the inferior gods, the many gods, and the worship of the singular god who was called Shangdi by the Chinese. That disappeared. So you can see all these interesting connections to the God of the Bible and how this emperor sort of spiritually brought them into the Dark Ages in a very real sense.
Wow, that is completely fascinating. Also curious if you want to share a bit with listeners, who are some of the key characters or personalities, some that we might fall in love with, some that we might not like as we encounter them in the story?
Yes. Well, first of all, we have the hero of the story his name is Antiochus. And he's actually the fallen son of the king. He was a disgraced general of the king. And he actually goes on the journey to redeem himself because he disobeys an order of the king, but it was a serious order such that it would deserve death. And so the king, in order to save his life, sends him on this journey on this quest to get a dragon because the king's kingdom is crumbling apart. He needs power. So it's a journey in the pursuit of power. And is power a good thing? Can it be used for good? Can it ever be good? Does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. These are the issues that I kind of wrestle with, And Antiochus has a lifelong friend who's a magi, and his name is Balthazar. And Balthazar is more of the religious man. So there's Antiochus, who's the man of action, the man of war, and Balthazar, who's sort of the man of religion, man of contemplation, and they challenge one another as they go on this journey together. And we, of course, meet the king the emperor Qin Shi Huangdi in China. And he was a fascinating character because one of the things I didn't mention was what made him so fascinating to me was he was on a pursuit for the elixir of eternal life. So he almost bankrupted his kingdom, his treasury, by paying just so much money for all his scholars and magicians to create this elixir of eternal life. And what happened was they were exploring things like arsenic and mercury. And if ingested in little at this point in time in their science, they thought that if they ingested little portions of things like mercury and arsenic, it would extend your life. Well, of course, what it actually did was it made the emperor go crazy. And so that's also a fascinating, dramatic storyline that we're covering. But then I also have the hero meets Mei Li, who's one of the concubines of the emperor. And there's a love interest there. There's a lot of romance in this story, more so than all my Chronicles of the Nephilim, I think. So there's a romance there with the concubine, and there's the right hand warrior of the emperor whose name is Wushu, and there's going to be a showdown there going on. So yeah, there's lots of these characters on both sides of the story, scholars and magicians and kings and warriors. It's all in there. It's the stuff of a movie, of a big epic movie. Because of my Hollywood background, I tend to want to write stories that will be like you're watching a movie. And that's kind of the feel of this. So there's a little bit of, you could almost kind of call it Raiders of the Lost Ark, goes to China, and because there's some elements of that going on there as well.
It could have been a catchy subtitle, but well, maybe a different time. Thematically speaking, with this series, is there going to be a core biblical or theological message that kind of weaves throughout all the books in the series? And you can just hint at it. You don't have to give anything away.
Yeah, there will be. It may. Yeah, there will be. For fans of the Chronicles of the Nephilim, this particular book, because it takes place in China and it's not, the other ones were Bible stories, right? So it was a little bit more outward. So it's a little bit more subtle and hinted at in The Dragon King, but the rest of the books will probably be much more, because I think I'm going to tell the story of Daniel, and some of those stories. But the principle is dealing with this notion of what are these watchers, these spiritual authorities that are behind the nations. That's an element that I wanted to play with and explore.
For you writing this first book in the Watcher series, were there some unique challenges that you faced that were different from those you'd experienced with the Nephilim series?
No, it's a lot of it's very much in the same vein. The big difference was working with a partner, working with Charlie. And quite frankly, I have to say that because of that, I think the story is one of my strongest stories, because there's just something about when you work with a partner, you challenge one another. You don't just settle. And things that I might like, he might question, and it forces me to work through it and support my belief. And I either discover, no, that's not a good way to go, or we discover something new, fresh that we can add to it that we didn't before, and vice versa. So I think this is one of the most, developed stories of mine, and it was because working with that partner. But in another sense, it's pretty much, it follows that same sort of pattern that I've been doing with the ancient historical research, how it fits in with the Bible and how it fits in with mythology and religious beliefs and spirituality, that kind of stuff. It's very much in the same vein.
And obviously the book at this point is out for a month and a half-ish, somewhere in there. Curious if you've gotten any interesting fan and reader response. Obviously, people know you well from the Nephilim series. Was there anything that really surprised the readers once they got into the new series?
Well, yeah, I have to be honest in that there were a lot of readers that were wished that I would have had an appendix like I did with the other novels, and that's where I started thinking, well, maybe I should start doing that again. But in terms of the story, they're loving it, and it's already got a bunch of reviews on Amazon, and people, I highly recommend go read the reviews and see what people say if you want to. But, if they really want to find out about the series, go to my website, Godawa.com, Godawa.com, and Chronicles of the Watchers, click on the tab. I've got tons of pictures. I cast all my novels. I put pictures of of the characters in the novels that I find, and artwork, and scholarly research and free articles that you can read. I try to make the website something that's really interactive and full of a lot of material for people who want to learn more about it. So you can go there to find out more if you don't want to just jump in and buy it. And it's available on Amazon, but Amazon is where all the reviews are that I know of the Dragon King. And yeah, so far, yeah, I mean, like I say, it's always, I always have a good initial sales, and just it's all about getting the word out, which is why I thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been long overdue. I think you and I talked almost a year ago that we needed to talk about some of your books. So obviously book one is out. What do you have in the works for book two? Like what time frame wise, is that a year out? Like how long? I don't even know how long it takes you to put one of these together.
Yeah, I'm usually doing about 2 books a year. But But here's the thing. This is a standalone. These novels are standalone. So what that means is you can read it as a self-contained novel and it makes sense. And the series is more connected conceptually. So, yeah. So if that makes sense, you can buy the book, The Dragon King, just enjoy it as an individual novel, not a problem. But I've actually started on another series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And I'm not quite ready to talk about it yet, but it's going to be coming down the pike fast, and it's going to actually blow everything out of the water that I've ever done. It's going to be my magnum opus. And so I'm kind of working on two series at the same time. So there might be a little bit of delay there, but we could talk about that later, but it's going to be it's just going to create controversy like you wouldn't believe, but it'll be really cool.
Well, two series at once, you're glutton for punishment, but, the Chronicles of the Apocalypse, one, it's ever timely, and it seems like a very timely period in history to have an apocalypse-related series. So I will be looking forward to hearing more about that as it presents itself, and you're ready to share about that. Again, for the listeners who want to connect with you, find out more about your books, where are some of the places they can find you online? Yeah,
it's pretty much Godawa.com. Everything's there. And by the way, there are hints about the Chronicles of the Apocalypse there too. So you can find all kinds of cool stuff there. Godawa.com, and then buying everything. Everything's available on Amazon. I do all my books in Kindle, paperback, and audiobook. So audiobook version too, I read it and people have been really enjoying it because I know the material real well and I'm not a boring reader. And people have been loving the audiobook versions as well. So the Dragon King audiobook is not quite ready. It should be ready in the next couple weeks. But all my other books are on audiobook. And so that's it. Basically Amazon or Godawa.com.
And for the audiobooks, is that available through Audible on Amazon as well?
Yes, yeah. So you go to Amazon and you could get it. I think you could, it's connected to Audible. So you don't have to have an Audible subscription. You can buy things individually through Amazon and it becomes an Audible connection there, I think, is how it works.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon owns Audible at this point. So
yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to check out the audiobooks. As a guy who runs a lot and has a long commute, I listen to tons of podcasts and audiobooks. So I will be sure to check out some of your stories. It'll be fun to hear you actually read them. But sadly, as it always is at the end of the show, it's time to bring things to a close. Again, many thanks to all of you for being a part of my conversation today with Brian Godawa. Once again, our book today was The Dragon King. And for more on Brian, be sure to visit his website, which you'll be able to find at godawa.com. Brian, just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you, man.
Thanks for having me, Shaun. Appreciate it.